So there it is. That is the USS Pampanito. World War II submarine. Sank. Forget the number. I think it was something like 6 Japanese ships during World War II. So this is a ship that can drive on the ocean and cruise for thousands of kilometers. And then when they want to, they can dive underwater like a submarine, and they can stay underwater for almost a day, maybe even longer, but not usually that long. So it's a very sneaky way of fighting, basically. But very pivotal in the war. Also, a lot of them sank. I think more than a quarter of them didn't come back. Let's go on board.
Alright, you guys got quarters left?
Here we go. So we're in the aft torpedo room. So what that means is these big, huge things look kind of like rockets. These are torpedoes, so these are a kind of bomb. What they could do is they had a crane here, and they would load them into these tubes in the back of the ship and shoot them out and try to blow up a ship with those. They also have bunk beds in here. You see that? So, from what I read about a ship called the Barb, they would have to share these beds until they shot a few torpedoes, and then they would get more beds in here. They wouldn't have to share anymore. What a terrifying place to be. So there's the bathroom for 85 people. This was built in 1943. Oh, look at this hatch. So this is where they controlled all the engines and the generators. And look, there's a little workshop over here. There's a metal lathe. I don't know, some other stuff up there. And it looks like transformers and breakers. And I guess this is one of the offices. That's all the space you get. It's barely enough room to even sit down. No wide butts allowed on submarines. My shoulders are almost touching both sides of this aisle. So this is the aft engine room. So these, I believe, are big, huge diesel engines. More space in here than I expected. There's one of the hatches. It's one of the ways in and out. So these round sides of the ship, that's the outside. So sometimes they would get bombs dropped on them even when they were underwater. And the whole ship would just shake. All the light bulbs would break, and bits of paint, and they put cork on the sides to, I guess, to insulate it. Cork would go flying, it would get in the air, and there'd be glass. Must have been just absolutely terrifying. They had a ration of whiskey to give out to all the men while they were being depth charged. It was medicinal whiskey to help calm everybody down. It's a different time. The sound in here would have been deafening when they were diving. And the smell and the heat too. Going into the forward engine room. So there were 4 engines on this ship. Whenever I see these little cubbies, I have to assume that that's where the crew kept all their stuff. So there was, I think, around 75 to 80 men on one of these ships. So you didn't get a lot of personal space. I can feel it rocking right now. It's kind of unnerving. The whole place is shifting around, just sitting here at the sitting here at the dock. It must have been really rough when they're out in the South China Sea. Can you imagine? I don't think any of us can. Rocking around. There's handles everywhere to grab, and I have a feeling these weren't here when they were at sea. This might have been added. I don't think we get to go down below, so I'm just looking to see what else I can see down there. It's the other part of the engines. So there was a little bit of space down the side of the engines here, and that's where they would store all the food, canned food and stuff for the ship's cook, because they had to feed all these guys for weeks at a time. These big stainless steel drums were used for making fresh water. So when the submarine was on the surface, they could use these to distill water, and they used most of the water in the batteries. I think the batteries are below and ahead here. And batteries need to have water in them to work properly, so they used a lot of water in those. And so then the whatever was left they could use for drinking or bathing, but they didn't get very many showers. Maybe every couple of weeks you might get a shower. Usually all you could get was a pail of water. That's about it. Here's some of the cork I was talking about. You can see bits of cork used to insulate things. And used to fly through the air when they were getting depth charged. Let's keep going. Seems like a laundry room. I didn't expect that. These must be showers. Oh, nice. So look, 3 bunks high. So somebody slept on the bottom. There's more of those cubbies. So 3 bunks high. Let's count how many spots we got. This is about the only room on the ship where the regular crew could just relax and have some recreation. So they had a radio here, and they had a record player, and they could apparently watch some movies, but they only had a few movies, so they had to keep watching them over and over again. And then down below here was the freezer and the cooler. And then this was the galley, the kitchen. This is where they cooked all the food for all the men. They were cooking 24 hours a day in here. So coming through here, this is the ship's radio room. This was very important, because this is the only way they could communicate back home. And they had special radios that typed secret code messages so that they could talk to each other without people being able to understand what was going on. But then coming in here, this is the main ship control room. So they use red lights in here sometimes because if you were working at night, you needed to be able to see in the dark. And if you use red lights, that doesn't hurt your night vision. But if you use regular lights and then you go outside, your eyes will have to adjust again. These green lights over here tell you if all the valves and ports and everything are ready to go, and then they could control the diving the ship from here. And then up above here is the conning tower, I guess. Too bad we can't go up there. That's where the periscopes were. And that's where they could kind of navigate and see what was going on around them. People who operated these ships, they weren't very old. It was all men, but almost all of them were in their early 20s. Most of them unmarried. A few of the officers and older guys might have had wives, but a lot of them were just young guys. Makes you kind of sick to think about it. That's the officers' quarters. So that's your office. That's what you get. There's a telegraph. USS Pampanito, 13 July 1944. Congratulations, Earl Watkins. Mom, 7 pounds 6 ounce son, born 8th July. Mother and son fine. That's how you found out that your baby was born. If you were out here during the war. So the officers are higher ranking. They're biggest, more important. They had a lot more space. Kind of like on the aircraft carrier. Oh, I bet you that was the somebody more important. So this is the commanding officer's quarters. So this is, I think, the only private room on the ship. And so he has a little desk and a bed. And they always have a sink so they can wash up before they come out of their rooms. But notice there's also a depth gauge and a compass in there. So even when he was sleeping in his bed, he could open his eyes and see what was going on. Now we're getting into the front torpedo room. So there's another batch of torpedoes. and 6 more torpedo tubes. And that's the front of the submarine. So you can see how these skids that the torpedoes sat on, they rode on rails here, and they could use those to line up with the torpedo tubes and load them in. So you could load them with just a few people. Getting them into this room, I think, would have been more challenging, but they had hatches and stuff to do that. It must have been very heavy. So these steel columns here were part of the sonar system. So these could squish down and stick out the bottom of the ship. And what that would allow them to do is to listen. And they could listen to ships all around them, and they could hear ships above them and detect their distance and location. And if they were being depth charged, that's when they would be dropping bombs on the submarine. They could hear the splash of the bombs hitting the water. They could hear the propeller of the ship passing overhead. They'd all just be sitting quietly, hoping that they would survive until the bombs went off, and then the whole place just shook. During one of the missions, the USS Pampanito, that's this ship, it picked up a bunch of, I think it was British and Australian prisoners of war that had been on a ship that had been sunk by another submarine. So they were people in the water that needed rescuing. And they picked up another 72 people and fit them somewhere in the submarine. So the already 70 or 80 people that were on here suddenly doubled. I just can't imagine how you would even fit them in here. You can sort of see the structure of the hull. So they built this big flat platform on top of the main deck. Some of the sailors talked about the most significant memory they took away from this was the rescuing of the prisoners of war. They had been in the water for, I think, 4 days, and they were covered in oil from the ships that they've been on. And they all thought they were going to die. And the Pampanito here sailed up to these life rafts. They didn't even know who was on them. And the sailors that were on the rafts were so happy to see them. This is the conning tower. You can see, I think that's a 20 or 30 millimeter gun on it. And the lookouts could stand up there and scan the horizon for any ships that they wanted to attack or support. That was the best they could do. They could stand up here with binoculars and look around. Later in the war they had radar and fancier technologies, but it was still a very dangerous place to be for the submariners, but also for any of the enemy ships. Said that later in the, or during the war, the submarine force was able to sink ships faster than the Japanese were able to build them. So it was a very effective part of the military, but at a great cost. It's a privilege to be able to stand here and enjoy taking this in as a museum now today. But I sure hope that we never need to use ships like this again. As cliche as it sounds, I can't imagine. I just can't imagine it. Hope you enjoyed the tour as much as I did. Somebody asked me my favorite part of the tour. I think it was seeing the crew mess, that sort of kitchen room where everybody gets to sit together and eat. And it's I've been reading this book about the USS Barb by Admiral Eugene Fluckey. It was one of the most decorated submarines in World War II. And he describes these scenes where after they'd sunk a ship, they would all gather in the crew mess, and the cook would bake a cake, and they'd have a celebration. And it's one thing to read about it, but it's another thing to sit and stand in one of these rooms where these men gathered and try to picture that many people crammed into that little room celebrating an attack that they'd made and celebrating their own survival. It's really astonishing.